I don't know whether James is going to address that, but at any rate, our next speaker is James Mendelson. He's an associate principal in the marketing and sales practice at McKinsey, and he's going to discuss the customer lifecycle management aspect of digital. So please give him a round of applause.
Thanks. I'm just recalibrating my talk based on the introduction. I have a fair amount of material that I want to share. I talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done at McKinsey on digital marketing, how consumers react, and the challenges for marketers in this space. But it's definitely a sea change, and I wanted to start with a little bit of baseball math to make a point about big data. And I spent a lot of my time in big data and database and digital analytics, and I'll have examples through the presentation from telco, financial services, and retail, which is the sectors where I spend most of my time. But a long time ago, about 120 years ago, this guy Henry Chadwick invented a way to assess pitchers. It was called ERA. It was really simple, and it worked really well for a long time. So for 100 years, we had this view of pitcher performance that was reasonably simple. Today, really, 20, 30 years ago, this started to shift, and we have a whole new set of metrics and ways to understand pitching performance. And the ones on the right side of the page aren't even exhaustive. And at this point, there are even more metrics to understand pitching as a very, very fundamental driver of baseball. And the reason we have this is the same reason and a lot of the challenges we have with big data. The first is that over a long period of time, we were able to amass a tremendous amount of knowledge on performance. So we had a lot of tracking data that was available to us. And then we had all of that data in analyzable form. So it was suddenly a lot easier to create spreadsheet models of pitching performance and link those to the outcomes that we were desiring. But the real differentiator, I think, for this is the passion of the people that really wanted to understand performance. And that, I think, is the difference in a lot of digital marketing now and a lot of big data challenges. It's the passion of the people that get involved that leads to the innovation and the change. So a lot of what we do in marketing, even in the digital arena, is very similar to the way we've marketed in previous media, previous generations. The difference is that we have data, we have the ability to unlock value, and we have a ton of passion to really leverage all the tools that we have at our disposal. Usually when I talk about digital, this is the point in a presentation where I usually choose a page, and we have a lot of research in different areas, but I choose a page to make the point that this is a very large, big phenomenon. And actually over time, the page that I've used has changed, and the audience can be a determinant of that, but I've used pages that say things like, broadband is increasingly available, or people have smartphones, people actually use the internet more than they use TV. And in our work with CEOs and boards of directors and CMOs, it's still surprising how much that data is relevant. But for this audience, I picked this slide because I think that the way people are using mobile is really instructive as a new wave of challenge. And this is from a study that we do in 12 countries around the world about how people use their mobile device. And it's principally focused on how people use it in purchasing. So we talk about search, shop, buy. But the prevalence and the rising amount that consumers are using mobile as a shopping aid, live in store for comparison of prices is the one on the top. And then what's growing is in-store purchasing. I don't think this is a surprise to this audience, because as a group, you're probably steeped in this stuff every day. But this is the kind of wave change that is the challenge for traditional marketers in whatever category to reach consumers that are taking advantage of digital technology, whether it's smartphones, mobile payments, other offers, to really change the entire relationship between marketer and consumer. And that is what leads us to rethinking about the life cycle and the purchase funnel for consumers. One of the things we've done over the last few years is study how people make decisions and make purchase decisions in a digital world. And so this is not just how people make purchases digitally. This is how people make all their purchases because they have digital to take advantage of. And so this is an evolution of the traditional purchase funnel. And the way we think about it is actually more of a journey and more of a loop. So versus the traditional purchase funnel of sort of awareness, consideration, trial, purchase, repeat, we start with consideration, but part of what the CDJ framework recognizes is that when a consumer actually first considers and they can become aware of lots of different options, at the point where they're going to buy, and this is the loop on the top, there's this evaluation at which any brand has almost an equal footing to enter themselves into the purchase decision because of the role of digital, because of the role of instantaneous research. So I do a lot of work with banks. And an example of this in banking is people walk around with a set knowledge of what banks are available to them. And some of it is driven by inertia, some of it is driven by the branches that they are walking or driving or living near, some of it by media, whether traditional or digital media. But at the point where someone goes to actually purchase a financial product or service, overwhelming majority of that purchase just starts online. And at the moment that someone is going through this consideration stage, every financial institution and there's some regulatory limits, so it's not the entire world, but for a US purchaser, every financial institution in the US is suddenly on equal footing. If you want a mortgage, you can be 2/3 of the way through a mortgage application with the bank that you've banked with, that you have theoretical loyalty to. And there's both the opportunity as a marketer to find and interrupt that activity, but as a consumer, you can also then wonder, well, what are the best rates available? What is the best product for me at this point in time? And that's where the ability to find new alternatives actually enters. So it's still important. There's still an advantage to being in the first position for that consideration loop. But the evaluation stage becomes very, very crucial for relevance. Along the bottom part of this loop, after someone has purchased, again, digital accelerates this, but it's not only happening digitally. As people experience it and as people start to advocate for the product, we see the interaction with, and again, across categories, whether that is in social media, whether that's sharing. Increasingly, advocacy is digital, so we see a whole new ability of consumers to influence others along this bottom part of the loop. And then the middle part, where true loyalty and this phenomenon of bonding between consumers and purchasers, consumers and brands happens. It can be a lot more sticky. You have a lot more ability to influence that, to create the kind of long-term loyalty that's actually quite valuable, but also increasingly difficult because of the pressures of digital. This is what it looks like in action. And I won't read through the entire text, but this is a study we did with a credit card issuer. And saying, broadly across the consumer life cycle for a card issuer, the challenge is we have to acquire customers, we have to get them to build usage and get to what we call first in wallet, where you're the primary card that's used for purchases and credit, and then ultimately drive loyalty. And loyalty measured by spend, by referrals, and by cross-sell, where you add other products to the relationship you have with the customer. At each step along this loop, there are very specific digital tactics that a marketer can use to make each of these things richer, more valuable, but also more productive. So in a world where customers are an incredibly precious asset, very difficult to acquire, but increasingly valuable once you have them in the fold. And this is true across all sectors, not just for financials. Executing these digital tactics well is really the next the next frontier. So we've had in a lot of these categories a very, very distinct bias toward acquisition. And then what's happening increasingly is the value that you can achieve by both developing a relationship with the consumer, but not for the relationship as a means to itself, but as a means to an end, a richer, longer relationship where you're both providing value to the customer, but also creating higher revenue, higher growth, and greater longevity. So when we look across a lot of different instances, I'm sorry, was there a question? All right, someone was just stretching. Excellent. So we look across a lot of different digital trends, and I'm looking over my right shoulder because their last presentation they had the live tweeting, so I keep feeling like I'm getting instant feedback on this presentation if I look the wrong way. So here's what we see, and I'll share some examples about each of these, and some of them are fairly common. Obviously more touch points, much higher expectations for the engagement with brands in a marketing way, in a commercial setting online, but not to the exclusion of brick and mortar. It's a complementary relationship. So when you're delivering, and in most of the sectors I work in, there is a high amount and a very, very strong preference for online delivery, but there is still a brick and mortar presence, a physical presence that we have to work with. And then ultimately data becomes very, very valuable, and the ability to work with and monetize data about your customers is increasingly important to achieving any of the things that we've talked about in the new consumer life cycle. And this goes across marketing, selling functions, how you deliver the product, how you serve customers. So just to share some examples on each of these dimensions. This is a telco client we worked with, and these are all the different ways they touch consumers. And these are percentages. So what we did here is basically took their marketing touch points, and we broke down the impact on acquisition from each of the channels. And a couple of things that came out of this conversation with the client. The point that we've highlighted here is that the thing that is actually the most out of their control from an intent standpoint is the negative buzz about them in social media. That had as large an impact in the wrong direction on their acquisition volume as all of their TV program. I mean, within shouting distance in terms of these percentages. And it was a fairly eye-opening conversation, talking to them about you spend an enormous amount of time, attention, and money on TV ads. You haven't corrected for what happens in social media. And in this particular case, it has to do with a lot of common sense things you can imagine. Poor activation experiences, spotty coverage, customer service failures, but all those things are amplified. So in a non-digital world, having long hold times or having difficult activation or spotty coverage wouldn't negate the power of television advertising. But in a digital world, it does. And we were able to put some mitigation factors in place for this client. The other thing that came out of this conversation was the time and attention, and I think other folks may have made the same point, but the time and attention that marketers are spending on traditional media relative to digital media is increasingly out of kilter with where the impact really is. So when we look at the impact of digital in this breakdown, depending on how you count, it's 1/3 to 1/2 of all acquisition. This particular client was not spending anywhere close to 1/3 to 1/2 of their time or energy in digital. And so the joke that Ted made in the last panel about, I'll paraphrase, right? My CEO hates me, my board thinks I'm destroying shareholder value, and those are the challenges that marketers are faced with, and we hear them in our work. This is part of why. Because where marketers need to be paying much more attention is in at least equal time in the digital realm versus I think where there's a lot more traditional comfort. So this will begin, I think we'll start to see continuous change as we are able to show more and more of the relative impact of these different touch points. In terms of online expectations, this is just a word cloud from some feedback we asked people about financial institutions. So we do a study every year with about 10,000 customers of various financial institutions on how they are being served, what they want, et cetera. And we ask them, like, who are the reference points for your how you want your financial company to mimic. And it wasn't specifically online. It was in general, how do you want them to act? There's actually only one financial company in this cloud, which is Vanguard, which is a nice, I think, endorsement of the things they've been able to do. But these are the usual suspects of great products, great customer experiences, great online interfaces. And there's no, there isn't an ability as a bank, for example, to say, but I'm a bank, I can't be like Apple. Because the customer's expectation is set by their complete sum total experiences. They don't grade on a curve. And particularly not digitally. So if the bar is set for online functionality by Apple, Google, Amazon, the likes of whether it's Bank of America, Verizon, Walmart, all have to work within that same hurdle. Because of the ability of the consumer to really demand that kind of online experience and increasingly offline. Just one comment on Southwest, because it's interesting how it comes up. And Southwest is a great example of the power of clear expectations with consumers. So if you set for the consumer a very, very clear understanding of what they will get, and then you deliver it. It doesn't have to be, kind of white glove. And this, I don't want to get off on a huge customer experience tangent, but a lot of customer experience work gets wrapped around this axle that says we just have to make the customer experience as good as it possibly can be, and that will result in benefit. Particularly online, it's actually much more about signaling what the experience will be, and then delivering on that signal versus trying to push it all the way to the limit. On the point about brick and mortar, this is an example from Neiman Marcus. Is anyone here from Neiman Marcus? Should have. Okay, well, if they were, they would be get the benefit of this, I guess. So this is a way of really bringing digital into the brick and mortar. So this is an app that Neiman Marcus is testing. And the idea is to take advantage of some of that mobile behavior that I showed before about the increasing prevalence of customers bringing the digital into the analog world. So the idea, this is an iPhone app that you can use when you're not in the store to manage your account and your purchases and your purchase history. But when you are in the store, it activates a whole bunch of different features. So as the consumer, it tells you, hey, these are some things you might want to look at that are in stock that are available today. It'll add calendar events if there are specific either fashion shows or specials or promotions that are going on. And it will tell you which sales associates you have dealt with who are working that day. And you have some ability to edit and control the notifications. So if someone you like is not working that day, it'll show that. There's a back end where it actually then notifies the people in the store that you were there as well. And this is a great digital solution to one of the brick and mortar problems of not necessarily being able to identify my customers as cleanly as I want. I work with a small bank in the Caribbean that has come up with a great analog solution to this. They don't have that many customers. There are 20 of their customers that represent a massive amount of their net income. So they printed up posters with photos of each of these 20 people. And they put them up in the break rooms of all of their branches. And there are only 12 branches. So there's not that many people that have to learn what these 20 people look like. That works for them, and it's terrific. And the idea that these are the highest value customers of this small bank, it's actually enabled them to execute. When you're Neiman Marcus and you have many more stores, many more employees, and many more high-value customers. And importantly, many more customers that have the potential to be high value if you can capture more of their activity when they give you the option. And a lot of the challenge that Neiman Marcus has had on the website is that due to some of the items they sell, especially the high fashion items, really don't necessarily lend themselves to the online experience. They have to be tried on, fitted, made a complete outfit. By the way, I work in retail, but I'm a little over my skis in high fashion, so you may be sensing that a bit. But I'm getting some head nods from some people in the room who sort of know what I'm implying. So this is a way that you're taking the digital world and marrying it to the physical world. This is a different example with Verizon, where the Verizon challenge is people don't necessarily search for phones in a branded way. So I want a phone, and so I'm going to enter a search for a new mobile phone, or particularly it might be handset based instead of service provider based. But they need to monetize the stores, and they find that the stores are actually much better at conversion. So driving traffic to the store is actually a really good strategy for them. And this is just a case of how they used some very sophisticated analytics to drive store traffic versus full online conversion. So they can work together. This is a blinded example of some work we did with a different department store around value migration. So this is about how many times are you coming to the store and what parts of the store you're shopping. And so the more categories, the more visits, the more value you're creating. And year on year, if you're losing trips or you're losing category coverage, odds are, allowing for some macroeconomy changes, someone is just buying the same stuff from someone else. And so how do you actually create leverage points using your digital relationship with the customer in order to make that happen? And so one of the solutions that's illustrated on the right is identifying these high potential customers who are migrating to less valuable cells on the heat map. And in this case, it's about using personal shoppers as an intervention. So again, a very classic analog intervention fueled by digital insight and leveraging the digital contact with the customer, but fulfilling in a very traditional personal selling way. This is another example from Delta, where they're taking a simple search and then bouncing back with more tailored marketing at +1 and +2 weeks. So even if I was just casually interested in flying to Barcelona, they're remembering that and they're continuing to make me relevant offers when I'm coming back to the site and in email. So what do we, and I just want to spend a couple more minutes and then have time for questions. We've done a bunch of work in big data. So a lot of things I've shown you around how do we actually leverage the entire digital life cycle. And what we find is, and I want to shift a little bit from revenue to margin because the margin story is actually quite compelling. So we look at the major factors that drive the firm, and performing well in big data can have significant impact on the margin contribution from getting better at things like marketing. And the point on price transparency is really the only massive negative from a provider standpoint in the big data universe, because it's so hard to differentially price, and you can't price differently across channels, and the ability of the customer to find the best, lowest priced option has had a significant impact. But it's more than offset by all the benefits you can have in all these different categories. This is an example of we're working with a credit card marketer in fairly classic digital tactics. How do we get better at traffic? How do we get better engagement? How do we improve conversion? And the margin impact of doing these things well is really quite significant. And so I just want to make sure that in the conversations we have, it's not solely about revenue and top line volume. It's also about bringing significant impact to bottom line performance. When we've studied this across categories, where you look at companies that do this well versus companies that don't, the advantage, not just in revenue, but in earnings, is really staggering. And particularly so in some of the categories that we've been talking about in retail and financials, where leveraging the power of all this stuff is really quite good. And some of the differentials in revenue aren't quite as close, and you really start to see the performance in income. A couple of closing thoughts. This is from some work we did on a workforce in the US, that one of the big things we're going to have to confront is the talent gap. So our demand for analytical talent is outstripping our supply. So there's a lot of potential mitigations to that. But in our conversations around what's the right flying formation, do we have central or decentral marketing organizations? Do we have a single or a confederation of agencies? At some point, this comes down to people that have the technical and analytical expertise to do the stuff that those organizations and confederations actually want. And this is actually the real stumbling block for digital, I think, in the next 10 years, is this talent gap to fuel all of our ambitions, not necessarily the strategic clarity that we sometimes talk about. So net, digital is a center of gravity, but not just digital. The presence of digital has actually shifted the entire way that we engage with customers, and it impacts all of our marketing, not just that which is sort of in the digital column. The impact is not just about top line. It's even more significantly about margin. And that's a conversation that, to the joke I was making earlier about shareholder value, margin contribution is a lot more compelling story in some cases, in some industries, than revenue maximization. In addition to all of the stuff we want to do, we have to build the right capabilities and skills to do all the things we've talked about and adapt this mindset, particularly around talent development, so that we have the people to execute the digital strategies that we've chosen. So a few minutes left for questions. Happy to.
Do you have questions? Well, one thing, I mean, oh, did you raise your hand? No, I'm not trying to make you ask a question. At any rate, one thing that you touched on is something that we all know very well in this room. You know, that digital as something that marketers focus on is lagging way behind reality, and that's kind of been the case almost, you know, for probably, I would say, a good 15 years. And just wanted a little more perspective on you know, why is that? I mean, because even the people making all these decisions and spending all this time are probably spending just as much time on their iPads and their iPhones as the rest of us, and yet it's not connecting in terms of where to focus your attention when you're marketing. And it's interesting. I would think that 15 years, you know, later we might be able to, you know, break that tide.
It's a very tough challenge. I mean, I think it like any other technology. I mean, the adoption and the diffusion of innovation works for this the way it works for anything else. And the rapidity of getting these devices and this technology in the hands of consumers has moved a lot faster. But there are companies that have taken advantage of it, and then they have left some of their more analog competitors behind. But there's actually, I think there's a little bit of how do you adapt the business model, and some fear around that, particularly in channel conflict, which has been tough for different organizations to overcome. But then I think there's the other thing, which is mindset. Mm-hmm. So you have management teams and you have marketers who didn't grow up with this, and may or may not trust it. And just to be candid, we've had discussions with management teams where we've shown them, here is the fact base, very similar statistics to what we've shown here, and it is very difficult. The example we've sometimes used is if you showed, you know, a management team a balance sheet that had bad news, they would absorb it much more quickly than showing them an analysis of marketing efficiency that has bad news. Mm-hmm. And I can't parse why that is, but hopefully it'll get better.
Yeah. Well, it's like what we were saying yesterday, that the way to get people to pay attention to social listening, this came up on one of the panels, was if you have a crisis, then management starts to pay attention to that and kind of realize the impact of it. And it sounds sort of similar.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, okay. Well, thank you. Oh, yes. Oh, Bob. Speaking of which, Bob, who was on that panel.
Thank you. Have you worked with any of your clients to set up ROMI models? And if so, what are those showing you in regards to the opinion that you put forth that we should be putting an equal amount of effort into the digital space as we are into the traditional space?
Mm-hmm.
Can you share any of that learning?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, that example is a good illustration of the point. So if I take a step back, we do a lot of marketing ROI work. We do it across sectors around the world. Couple of common things that come out. A lot of the work we see can really be improved with more, obviously more data, better analysis, clear links to strategy. And we have actually a lot of assignments where it's less about building the model and the analysis, and it's more about the capability build for the organization about how do you take this stuff and actually drive different marketing decisions. So in the example that I shared, part of the impact is not just showing that negative social buzz is countervailing a lot of your investment in marketing. It's actually pointing out that you're getting all of the benefit from this part. And we use the balance sheet analogy. If you had 4 divisions and one of them was contributing half your income, you would spend more than a day a month on that division's what was driving it. And it is a bit of a journey with clients. I mean, I think certain people in certain places, they have immediately wanted to make changes, but then you have an organizational change model that you have to follow. So a lot of the work is not just the modeling; it's the capability build with the organization.
Okay. Thanks, James. I guess we'll get, somebody can go get the teens into the room. This is a panel that we do at a lot of summits. I've referenced it a little bit from up here. And what we like to do is get people from a certain market segment, in this case, it'll be teenagers, to come in and really tell us about their media use. And it's always interesting. Sometimes it really does seem to kind of track with all the studies that we all look at and all that, and sometimes it really doesn't. But either way, it's kind of fascinating, and they're kind of a breath of fresh air from all of us jargon meisters, frankly. So our not in sort of the way that you would do a research study, but our moderator, who's coming up here, Michelle Prieb, has done these for us for a really long time. She's currently an account supervisor at Edelman, and did this for us when she was working at Ball State. We're really happy to have her back, no matter who she's working for. But at any rate, she's kind of interviewed them pretty extensively, so. We'll get to see some kind of interesting insights. So are we all set up here? So please give the teens a round of applause. It's probably not easy to stand up here.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So glad that you're here. We are joined today by a group of